and welcome to the very first event for the AI Frontiers Forum. We launched about a week ago and we already have 101 members, which is great. And in June this year, I launched one of the first generative Gen AI Con, which was at Tobacco Docks. So I'm really enjoying doing these events. I've done a lot of virtual events, but it's great to see you all in the flesh, to have some networking, and hopefully we'll have a bit of audience participation as well. So, did you know that you can take a picture of what's in your fridge, and then you can ask ChatGPT, and then you can use a tool like Midjourney to visualize that recipe. So here we've got some exotic concoctions. We've got blueberry and white chocolate sundae, and we've got a unicorn sundae, and we've got a padron pepper Doritos flavor. Has anyone created any generative AI recipes? Oh, okay, we've got one.
My wife has.
Yes, go ahead. What did you make?
What did she make? We are mostly vegan, so it would have probably been something like you say, from the fridge. Can't remember exactly what it probably featured beans, because beans are really important, and some fried vegetables.
Great. So we're going to start with a bit of a cooking demonstration. I've got my plate, which is aptly named Greed. So does anyone know how to make a sandwich? I'm going to run through making a little sandwich, following the instructions from ChatGPT. I've got a bit of ham. I've got some lettuce, if anyone wants to eat this afterwards. Soggy bread. But what else has ChatGPT given us? Of course, we need to glue our bread together with some super glue. There we go, got to stick nicely. And then some rat poison. So here's a little bit of rat poison, because there's so many rats in London, you just don't want them to nick. And this is, of course, a real-life example of what can happen when you create an application on top of something like ChatGPT. So there was a supermarket in New Zealand called Pack and Save, and it was coming up with all sorts of recipes using people's ingredients, including Oreo vegetable stir-fry, yogurt dumpling guacamole, and can anyone guess aromatic water mixes?
Like sparkling water?
Sparkling water was a good guess.
Benzene.
Benzene?
Bleach and ammonia, maybe.
Yeah. Exactly, someone's actually paying attention. So effectively it gave the ingredient list for creating chlorine gas. So Pack and Save then replied, of course, there's just a small minority of people who are hacking the tool, and they're going to keep fine-tuning the controls and making sure that only over 18-year-olds use this. However, if we look at the number of people who have followed their GPS and found themselves in the water and just listened to common sense, I think we have to worry a little bit about people following robots. So who is liable in this case? Does anyone have any points of view? You're in public policy, what would you say?
I'm not a lawyer, so
you're not, you're not a lawyer. But who would you go after? Save, or the silly user who's been hacking the system?
I'd like to go after the silly user, but I think that's okay.
Or it could be OpenAI. So I think it's a matter of everyone within this whole ecosystem is responsible and liable that the applications are safe, and that's what the EU AI Act is ultimately providing. So a lot of these bots are being built on LLMs, and LLMs can do a multitude of different things, from text generation to classification. Here are a number. And they are through APIs, but there are some new tools that are being developed so that you can start to build applications in a no-code environment. And what are we looking for when we're building these apps? We're looking for something that's high performance and reliable. We're looking for something that's protecting your sensitive information, and it's non-toxic, discriminatory, and doesn't have any bias within it. However, the realities are somewhat different. So when it comes to high performance, often what we find with these LLMs are they're very convincing bullshitters. They will convince you that they know the truth and that they've added all of these resources and links, and you can click on them, and of course they're made up resources. So we have to become almost good journalists, good at fact checking, and making sure that they're hallucinating. Another issue that we have is to do with its consistency. So if you slightly change the prompt, the answer will be completely different. And then the last problem that we have when it comes to performance is to do with language, because of course ChatGPT and OpenAI has been trained in English, but it needs to support languages all around the world. And yes, it does support different languages, but not to the degree that we're looking for right now. And then when it comes to sensitive information, is anyone concerned about OpenAI having access to your sensitive information or your business's information? So obviously we've had GDPR, and you might, in the last week, Dropbox has released a feature where it gives third-party access, so that their AI tools are basically built on OpenAI. So it means all of your documents that you might have saved within Dropbox are now being fed into OpenAI. So we have to, as consumers, we have to hold these platforms accountable for having access to your data. Of course, you can opt out, but you have to be very, very careful about what settings you are on, and any changes of terms and conditions that might come through to your email and you have just been opted into. So other.
That's automatic, or you have to opt out, or.
So they naturally opted everyone in, and then people had to opt out, but I'm sure they're going to switch that around because of issues there. And so countries like Italy have actually banned ChatGPT because of these issues with privacy. And if you're a company, you might be building an AI tool on top of an LLM, which is fantastic at coming up with new ideas, new innovations. However, you have to be careful about leaking your IP secrets to the underlying model, and also how your employees are using these tools. Are they feeding into it contracts with sensitive information? Are they redacting information? So all of these are risks that we all have to be concerned about. And lastly, we have issues around bias. So what an LLM will be doing is looking for patterns in order to make decisions. And what we don't want to happen is a number of toxic language being training the LLM. So for example, if you train your LLM on Twitter's language, you're going to get all of the controversial swearing and name calling, and already Bing has been answering back hacks and things like that. You also have harmful stereotypes that are perpetuated. So all of our biases then get perpetuated by the LLM. So we have to train the LLM to treat one another in a pro-social manner. Some examples of this is North Point's Compass tool predicted criminal reoffending by incorrectly giving black defendants a higher risk of reoffending than white defendants. There was also resume screening tool, which basically penalized resumes where there were female applicants because it was looking for similar applicants from the past. So anyone who said female or they're a woman were penalized. And then lastly, we had Apple's with Goldman Sachs, which were investigated for giving men a higher credit limit than a man's wife who had a higher credit score. They then investigated this and used explainable AI to explain why it made certain decisions, proven not guilty. However, that's the importance of explainable AI, trying to get why it's making certain decisions, because often it can be a black box and we have no idea why it's making certain decisions. And you might prompt it the next minute, it might make a completely different decision. So these are all risks that we have to take into consideration. Here are a couple of AI scandals. So you can see a number of the fines that have already been issued, and there will be more fines that come after the EU AI Act gets enforced. And lastly, we've got the Grace platform. And the Grace platform is a fantastic platform for enabling governance and compliance. You can register models, you can track bias and explainability. You can also check how people are prompting ChatGPT, all of your LLM usage within your company, and it's going to be compliant with the EU. I'd love to welcome onto the stage James.
Hi everyone. I do have time as well.
Would you like to introduce yourself, and we can get started.
Hi everyone, my name is James Wong. I work as a lawyer at Clifford Chance, which is a global law firm. In my job, I global companies on strategic issues, from the emergence of new technologies. So AI is a very big discussion at the moment, as you'd imagine, as well as negotiating transactions and big deals. So large client base in private equity and other financial sponsors who are looking at issues like AI at, I suppose, more of a portfolio level. So in terms of the choices around portfolio investments that they're making, how do we start to put the puzzle pieces in place for the years to come? I previously worked in Australia and New Zealand, as you can probably tell from my accent. Yeah, that's quite a dynamic marketplace as well. I think because of it's able to act as a bit of a test bed for new products, new ideas, and so there've been a few projects I've worked on in healthcare AI, in financial services, and in government, which has been interesting to witness.
Well, I'm going to kick off, and then of course Tom is going to be joining us as well on Zoom. He's in Bristol. So my first question is, what types of conversations are you currently having with clients regarding the EU AI Act, and how are companies preparing for it?
So EU AI Act, it's still quite early days, to be honest. So some of my clients are like quite large global corporations who you'd probably expect to be earlier on in the piece, but a lot of those discussions have been around horizon scanning. How's the landscape evolving? What can we expect in different jurisdictions around the world? And I think a lot of those efforts have been more around how do we make a meaningful contribution towards the development of these laws and regulations, rather than looking at the draft text and trying to come up with concrete proposals for how to move forward. So it is early days, and I think once we have a more concrete piece of draft legislation, we're still kind of looking at something that's now quite old, and the discussions have moved on, particularly the last couple of weeks. So it is early days. I think some of the conversations that we're having are a more strategic sort of conversations. So what are our current products that use AI in different ways? What does the roadmap of development look like over the next kind of 2, 3, 4, 5 years? And to be honest, a lot of the more kind of substantive discussions around concrete steps have been around getting kind of more basic things in place. A lot of organizations are still struggling with, I would argue, more fundamental things like what data do we hold, how is it governed, where is it? As particularly large organizations have quite an aggressive timeline for implementing new systems, reaching new customers, expanding into new markets, you very quickly end up with like a trail of systems, legacy systems, things that work in parallel. So even relatively like kind of core elements of the GDPR are still elements that organizations are trying to uplift to. So in terms of preparing for the AI Act, those discussions have been centered on, well, have we got the fundamental building blocks in place? Because once you start to comply with more and more regulations, the AI Act, but also different laws around the world which are emerging, it'll be so important to have those fundamental foundational building blocks in place. Otherwise, there'll be a lot of kind of remedial homework to do.
Mm. So can you describe, you mentioned healthcare and governments as some of your clients. Can you describe the types of AI systems that they're currently building and some of the opportunities, as well as, you know, there are plenty of risks, but what are the opportunities for these entities?
Yeah, so I'm very excited about AI, which is, I suppose, why I work in this space. I'm an optimist for the kinds of things that AI can do for society. And I think this question around some of the kinds of AI systems that I'm seeing, I think the threshold question is, what is an AI system? And the EU AI Act uses quite a broad definition of AI. Paraphrasing a bit, it's kind of any system that brings in some sort of input around a particular set of circumstances, analyzes that, and gives some sort of output. Now, it's a little bit more technical than that, but that actually encompasses a lot, or could encompass quite a lot. And so the kind of fundamental problem that I have is, okay, if we're going to try and name some use cases, some applications, some AI systems, does that include a lot of things that have already existed for 10, 20 years? So a lot of software systems could be caught under the definition of AI that we're looking at in the draft proposal. In terms of some things that I've been seeing with my clients, I think a lot of stuff which is AI is kind of relatively basic stuff that we've seen for a while. So ongoing conversations around recommender systems, around targeting products to particular segments of customers, targeting advertising. There's a lot of process automation. So how do we make existing processes that are done by humans a little bit more efficient? I'm seeing a lot of implementations of systems like ChatGPT. So one of the most powerful, I think, immediate use cases within most organizations is to speed up the process of brainstorming. So if you think about 20 years ago when you wanted to have a discussion around, okay, what kind of product do we want to design next? Which market do we enter next? And there'll be kind of a boardroom full of people who will say, kind of mapping out different ideas on a whiteboard. That process is now so much faster thanks to things like ChatGPT. So you might not kind of consider that the traditional process automation, but we are truncating the timeline for some of these kinds of conversations. In the financial services space, there's a lot happening in fraud prevention and detection. So massive problem, particularly for a market like the UK, where finance is a really important pillar of the economy. A lot of money is spent detecting and preventing fraudulent transactions. And you're always up against people who engage in this sort of behavior, kind of catching up with the detection system. AI is going to further accelerate that. And so we're seeing associations of banks, of financial institutions, of insurers, using AI increasingly to detect and prevent fraudulent transactions. And then in healthcare, I'm particularly excited about the role that AI can play in diagnosis of conditions, of diseases. Using large data sets, and we know, of course, the NHS has the largest healthcare system in the world, so a lot of data, a massive source of competitive advantage for the UK as compared to the global landscape. Using that data to have more consistent approaches to detecting at earlier stages diseases as they come up. And then I'm also excited about applications that I'm seeing in transportation and city planning. So we're seeing a lot of applications of how do we optimize problems like distribution of goods and providing packages to consumers faster and more efficiently, using less petrol in more environmentally friendly ways. And I think we've got Tom join us.
Welcome.
Tom.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me via Zoom.
Would you like to introduce yourself to our audience who are here today? I can just give you a little preview of our audience.
Brilliant. Hi, everybody. I'm Tom Whittaker, a senior associate independent UK law firm Burgess Salmon. I am a technology lawyer when I want to be an optimist, but in effect I'm a dispute resolution lawyer. So I'm often going to court or going through regulatory enforcement. So I think about things from a risk management perspective, but I've been advising on the EU AI Act and other AI regulation as well. It's great to be with you.
How's the sound? It's okay? Great.
A little bit louder.
A little bit louder.
Just there's so much noise from the cafe, at least up here.
Okay. Let's see. So we're on question 2, and I'd love to pose that to you as well, which is, can you describe some of the types of AI systems that your clients are developing at the moment? So looking at more of the opportunities within the space.
Certainly. So one of our main clients who advises on the EU AI Act is one of the world's largest foundation model providers. And so from their perspective, they've got quite a range of downstream opportunities and their AI systems may be deployed, but also some of the third-party infrastructure that they can provide. So it's really, the opportunities are in some ways in the types of output that can be generated by generative AI, the ease with which it can be implemented within their clients' systems, third-party systems, with which people can use it as well. But I think very much with those opportunities come risks as well. So that whilst you see these applications in different sectors, you then see very specific risks appearing. You have to integrate that with existing regulation for those areas, and also there is a risk that people approach the opportunities without proper analysis and understanding and management of the risks as well. But the big ones that I can see from our side are very much in the healthcare, financial services and public sectors.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Unfortunately, my audio is not the best, so you might have to just speak up a little bit. But can everyone more or less? Good. So what steps should companies take to prepare for the EU AI Act, especially determining if they fall under the high risk category? Do you want to go ahead first?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I can start. But so I think the first step is really to create some sort of inventory of all the AI systems that, or things that could be AI systems, depending on the interpretation of the Act when it comes out. That might seem like a fairly basic thing, a list, but particularly in a larger organisation, making a list can be a very challenging task to undertake, particularly where you have a fairly distributed organisational structure with lots of different things under lots of different people's control. And particularly in the cultures of some technology companies where employees are encouraged to experiment, to try things, there can very frequently be lots of different things happening in the organisation that the legal team, the compliance team, the kind of management teams don't know about. So that's kind of the main first step, and then it'll be a question of applying the definitions in the EU AI Act against that inventory. That's kind of the kind of basic piece. Maybe I'll hand over to Tom so that we can kind of keep it moving.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I agree with all of that, and especially the difficulties of creating such a list. And where I'd take that to next is by identifying the stakeholders, both within your organisation and outside. The issue that I've heard from various is that it's quite hard to know where to place your risk management overview teams within the organisation. Is this led by the data protection privacy team? Is it led by the commercial, the product teams? Is it led by the legal and risk teams? And the fascinating thing I find about AI is it's very much cross-sector, it's very much cross-sector specialism, and so you need to get buy-in from all of them. Now the risk is that too many cooks spoil the, whatever the phrase is, spoil the phrase. So you have too many people involved in effect, and you then don't have anyone who has clear ownership and accountability over the AI system. And the AI Act is there so that there needs to be a proper human oversight and accountability with AI systems. So mapping those stakeholders, knowing who needs to be informed, who needs to make decisions, what they need to know and when is particularly important. Back to you, James.
And final thing that I would add is just around some of the rights that might emerge out of the AI Act. Over the last couple of weeks, we've seen discussions around potential rights that that individuals that are impacted by AI systems might have. So they might have the ability to complain about an AI system. They might have the ability to request an explanation, a description of how the AI system works. And just from I'd be interested to hear what you have to say on this, Tom, but advising organizations of all different sizes on GDPR compliance, that is an issue that isn't always easy to do. So responding to requests, responding to communications that you receive from different stakeholders can be quite a time-consuming and resource-intensive exercise. In terms of preparing for that, I think it's about having those basic pieces in place first. So having the documentation in place, knowing who's responsible for which components of a system, where they sit, how to contact them, what the escalation pathways are, so that when these requests come in, you can kind of not be waiting around for too long before you kind of get out of the starting blocks and respond.
I'd agree with all of that, and I'm broadening out so it's not that. So it's GDPR request, but then also potential litigation, regulatory queries, questions, indeed in questions from investors and other stakeholders who need to understand the processes that you have, and you then need to map out whether there is a legal basis for that and whether you are required to respond, or whether you think it's also in your commercial interests to respond as well. And the risks that I've seen from some clients before is that without that mapped in advance, without taking a proactive approach, you become entirely reactive. So you may not have the right people, the right documents, the right processes in place. And then there is also a risk that things fall between the gaps. So if something gets escalated to one person in your organization, if they're on leave, if they don't pass it on and escalate it, then the right people don't know about these things at the right time. So there's a lot of preparation that can be done with mapping these things out, but bearing in mind that even with the best laid plans, they still aren't always brilliant when it actually comes to it. So you need to have that flexibility as well. But there can be particular foundations you can get in place now.
Wonderful. And I agree that sorting out the data strategy before looking at AI strategies is fairly fundamental. I'm not sure if you've had any clients that start to use synthetic data instead of, the real company data.
I can, yes, but can't really say much due to the nature of it. But it's within in the public sector for certain criminal investigations and law enforcement, where they're trying to use synthetic data rather than actual data, which can be highly fraught with personal data, ethical issues about using data from victims of crime to be able to inform their models. And so instead want to use synthetic data to try and address some of those privacy issues, ethical issues, but still allow them to then meet those and legal obligations that they have to try and enforce the law. But yes, there's I know the ICO as well has written about synthetic data too, so it's an active field, which James probably knows
We've
more.
got 2 questions from the audience.
I'll be allowed to ask questions
Yes,
during
please do.
Okay, great. Firstly, is it possible to give a quick response to how does GDPR and the new EU AI Act, how do they intermesh?
How does yes, exactly. How does the GDPR AI Act work together, or do they contradict one another?
Forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think James probably better placed with GDPR, but happy to give it a shot.
So GDPR is primarily concerned with personal data. And that means that we're dealing with a subset of the data that's out there. It means that there are certain data sets that GDPR is not interested in. And it also means that you can take certain steps in respect of a data set so that you can avoid parts of the GDPR. One bit that doesn't necessarily fully belong in GDPR is Article 22, which relates to automated decision making. It's placed in there because of a little bit of overlap with the kind of data protection, data privacy side of things. But the new EU AI Act kind of massively expands upon that idea of automated decision making. So in terms of the overlap, in many ways, both regimes will apply once the EU AI Act comes into force, where we're dealing with processing of personal data in the AI kind of life cycle is firstly sourcing the data that you train your model on. That is a form of processing personal data if there's personal data involved. Then in terms of testing, then in terms of day-to-day use, there are touch points that you'll need to analyze and understand against GDPR requirements. So that's the first piece. The second piece is around all the different aspects of automated decision making. So the current requirement is that you can kind of individuals have a right not to have their personal data used for automated decision making that will have a legal or other significant impact on them. But the EU AI Act is going to kind of touch that space in a big way, and that's where I might hand over to Tom.
The AI Act has been drafted with the intention that it works alongside the GDPR and that it is intended not to be inconsistent with the GDPR. There are certainly provisions which say that for certain deployers of high-risk AI systems, where applicable, then certain data protection impact assessments need to be carried out, but it's drafted in a way which is supposed to be consistent with the GDPR. So you would still turn to the GDPR in that respect. There is, however, that risk that whilst they say that it's supposed to be consistent and that meeting GDPR obligations will satisfy certain parts of the AI Act, that is not how it will work in practice. So I expect this is very much an area to watch over the next year or two, depending on implementation period times, to see what further guidance and technical standards come out, both from the EU and also from standard setting organisations.
Wonderful. I've got my next question, but if you can hold on to that question, I'll ask you next. So how does the certification process work? AI applications, and is self-certification sufficient?
Maybe I'll give the short answer in the room and then hand over to Tom. The answer is that for high-risk AI systems, you have all the requirements in the AI Act, and then there's the requirement to actually check that all these requirements are made. There are some instances where that can be done internal to the organization, but particularly encourage this culture of accountability. In many, I think there's going to be a whole industry emerge around AI assurance, and that will be part of that. Will be performance assessments, as they're called in the draft legislation. Tom's actually quite a big expert on this. You've probably written about it more than most. But do you want to go into a bit more detail about how the certification process?
There is the step where you have to, well, depending on who you are,
you'll have to consider whether a conformity assessment is needed and whether a system or systems may be considered high risk. And in the event that you do consider them to be high risk, then you would designate them as such, and that you go through the conformity assessment procedure. However, if you then decide that the high risk, then you may have to make a notification to the applicable authority in order to confirm that's the position, and then you have to wait a number of months to see what the output of that is. So there is a risk to come back and say, actually, it should be high risk, and you should have gone through a conformity assessment in any event. What I'd expect to see from many is that you have to do that initial analysis. What sort of legal entity are you? Are you a provider? Are you a deployer, etc.? Then working out what sort of AI system that you have, so that you can start to map out what your potential obligations are, but in particular to work out whether your AI system or systems is high risk. And then you will have that as a body of evidence to show your internal decision making, which will be relevant to many other aspects of what you do. And it will be from there that you'll then think, well, should you go through that notification process, and should you go through that conformity assessment process as well? And I'd expect that many will be taking a risk-based approach, risk-averse approach to going through those assessments and making notifications. The alternative of saying that you're not high risk or not going through that process, only to find out that the authority then says you are high risk, and then you have to make substantial modifications. You may have to withdraw the system from the market. You may have fines. All of those potential consequences are so significant. Actually, it is more practical and commercially preferable to go through the notification process and conformity assessment process at the beginning. The reason why I chuckled towards the beginning about whether it was an effective process is that there's certainly been heavy criticism from certain fundamental rights groups about this self-notification procedure, and concern that those authorities may not have the right expertise or resources to be able to properly monitor and consider all of those notifications, and that these fundamental rights groups are very concerned that this is about self-regulation, and that there is a history whereby the technology industry, or at least certain within the industry, may have their own interests to play out, and they may not be aligned with broader societal fundamental issues as well. Obviously, many sides to that story, but there are certainly some people who are highly critical of this process.
Wonderful. So we were talking earlier about the recent partnership that's developed with OpenAI and Dropbox. So what is the responsibility of companies ensuring that the third-party suppliers comply with the EU AI Act?
So yeah, this is huge. The third-party piece is, I think, where a lot of organizations are going to have the kind of highest involvement with the EU AI Act. So you might not necessarily be building the kind of building, but you'll be interacting with a whole network of different third parties who will play different roles. There will continue to be there will continue to be a role for supplier due diligence, and that role will expand. So this kind of process of assessing a vendor before taking them on is going to become even more critical. There will be all sorts of contractual norms that emerge around undertaking ongoing audits and assessments because of these requirements. Risk management on an ongoing basis is going to become very important, because a lot of the obligations in the are around documentation, record keeping, logging. We should expect to see specific obligations around these in a lot of contracts with third parties. And then more broadly, you've got the normal things that you'd expect to see in a contract, but they'll become pivotal to AI environment, things like allocation of liability, indemnities, warranties, compliance with laws, who's responsible for
kind of different aspects through the supply chain. These will come very important. And I think the practical challenge with a lot of this is that it is still quite early stages for some of the newer technologies. And so what is market practice, what is normal, hasn't really fully kind of matured yet. So I think there will be this few years of setting those norms. And I think that will be very interesting.
And I completely agree on that point about what is best practice or reasonable practice, especially in an area of a fast-moving, emerging technology where people are still coming to grips with it. That is particularly important from a legal perspective because you'd expect that contractual clauses to best practice or reasonable practice or what the market practice is. In particular, there's clauses for the EU AI Act around high-risk AI systems, although very much in draft for discussion, and that then refers out to market practice. Similarly, in the UK, there's the Society for Computers and Law AI group, which has produced model contractual clauses. And again, that very much refers out to a series of schedules to be agreed between the parties, which then sets out what their agreed requirements are and what reasonable practice would be. So it will be very difficult to know for certainty in the future exactly what that will look like. You can probably take some assurance based off of, in the UK, the common law, in the EU, depending on the jurisdiction, whichever law will apply there, about how contracts will be interpreted or what the obligations are upon parties. But it will still be an area of legal and commercial risk to navigate.
Wonderful. I'm going to skip to the next question, which is, are there any provisions in the the EU AI Act for law enforcement agencies to use software otherwise banned, like facial recognition? And can AI results be used as evidence in a trial?
I'm happy to go. So haven't full text of the Act after the political agreement, and it's very likely that there will be further negotiations over the coming weeks and couple of months as well. So this is one of the highly political issues that there is, that goes to the heart of some of the exceptions within the Act. Certainly from what's been publicised and from the previous version, that there are exemptions for law enforcement for certain types of AI systems, such as facial recognition, subject to getting a judge's order in advance to say that they can be used. And you can certainly see that in practice at the moment with the World Cup in France next year, I think Atos is using facial recognition to assist French law enforcement authorities, live facial recognition. So there's obviously a view that many of these things can be used in some way, but you do have to navigate the exceptions and the requirements of the AI Act. In terms of whether the outputs could be used within trials, not a criminal lawyer, so I suppose it will very much depend on how the police can then use it as evidence. And I can only think of it from the UK perspective of Police and Criminal Evidence Act, of whether it would meet those requirements. I think there is a wider point to be made, which is that any of an AI system does risk being used within court cases or used in other ways as well. Even if you think you are managing it securely, you should be aware that there is always a risk of attacks, of internal theft, and that output could be used in different ways. And so even if it's intended to be used as part of law enforcement, it could be used in other ways as well. And those risks need to be mitigated.
Not much to add on that. I think it's hard to comment too much until we do see the final text that's come out of the last couple of weeks of negotiations. It is hotly contested. I think it goes back to the forever debate around security versus privacy. So it'll be interesting to see the outcome. A lot of the participants in the trilogue debates have been quite heated in their contributions to that discussion. So I suppose we'll wait and see.
And it'll be very different in China, for example, how they use facial recognition to the EU. So I'll bundle my last question together and then take some questions from the audience. So how can the EU AI Act remain relevant amongst the ever evolving AI technologies? And do we have enough experts to deal with the proliferation of AI?
How does it remain relevant? So this is actually quite a fundamental problem in making laws, and it's particularly pronounced in technology, and in recent years when technology has been moving at a very fast pace. The kind of simple solution is to keep things at a high level, keep them principles based or even values based. The difficulty there is that the actual precise application of those principles becomes a matter for interpretation. And do you leave that interpretation to the participants themselves, so to companies who have the resources to employ lawyers to come to views on various principles? Or do you set kind of prescriptive rules? Compared to other regimes, the EU takes a comparatively prescriptive approach. So particularly for high risk systems, it's kind of maybe we should have kind of explained, given a summary of the regime, but you've got high risk systems. Sorry, I should start from the start. You've got prohibited systems that ban practices that are completely not okay. You've got high risk AI systems for which there are very prescriptive requirements, and then you have the kind of the lower limited risk systems where there are just kind of general principles. So not prescriptive requirements. You can still follow those same prescriptive requirements, but the requirement is more of a general one. And I'd add to that over the last couple of weeks, we've seen the insertion of a new category, which is around general purpose AI, including foundational models, departs a little bit from the existing kind of approach that was taken to drafting. Criticism that some have leveled against the EU proposal is that as things develop, as technology changes, some aspects could become outdated and just be compliance for the sake of compliance. Different approaches have been adopted in different parts of the world. The US, as you might imagine, has taken a little bit more of a industry self-regulation approach, but they've identified specific areas where they want to regulate. Say, as a broad brush statement, a lot of those are around consumer protection. China has taken a kind of, they've moved quickly, but they've what I would describe as maybe a slightly vaguer approach, which allows more flexibility and enforcement, but you lose a lot of the kind of clarity and certainty. And I personally quite like the approach the UK is taking so far, although I'd prefer emphasis on different things. But the UK has taken a little bit more of a, let's kind of see how things develop. And the reason that the UK can confidently do that is for many of the higher risk applications of AI, there is already context-specific regulation in place. So when we look at something like financial services, where there are lots of risks, and it touches many aspects of society, we have in place financial regulation. When you look at medical and healthcare applications of AI, there is product liability requirements around medical devices, etc. And so that kind of context-specific approach allows for flexibility for kind of AI innovation in general, but it also provides specific protections to areas where we particularly care about. So how do things kind of stay flexible for the future? I think keeping things high level. I think the way that will play out with the EU is that they'll have to make incremental changes and edit things through guidance in the years to come.
Just on the point about whether there are enough experts, that is a real concern at government level about whether there are enough experts, even in the public sector, in order to AI systems, but also within what's called the wider AI assurance ecosystem in the UK. I expect that will be an issue across about having the right people in the right places, especially whether they are part of the technology industry already, whether they're part of regulators or part of governments to be able to push these things forward. But certainly in the UK, there is a very big push to improving the AI assurance ecosystem. The usual suspects, as you would expect, lawyers, the accountants, the auditors, but then also there is a growing list, albeit still relatively small, of AI auditors and AI assurance experts who can then go in and red team your operations or red team a third party's operations, subject to whether they're allowed to, and who often find a way that they can then automate some of these processes as well. So going back to James's very original point about mapping out all of your AI systems, there are some providers who say that they can help you map those things out and then have an ongoing life cycle of monitoring and assurance over those systems too.
Wonderful. Hopefully using the Grace platform, which I advise you all to take a look at. So the question is, for global company that has offices in the US, maybe that's where they've developed, like OpenAI, for example, that has global reach, how will they deal with the two different systems in the US and the EU? Will two completely different products that get released? Or will they try and harmonize this, and will the EU take sort of the precedent or the
So there is a risk of a international regulatory patchwork, and there is political movements to try and bring greater international regulatory interoperability, as they call it, so to reduce the risk of that patchwork. However, I think it's inevitable that different jurisdictions will take different approaches, and in any event, different sectors will take different approaches, because the EU, the UK, and others have all said that risk is sector specific, and that there will need to be specific guidelines and regulations around those sectors. What you saw from in the early summer, I think, was Sam Altman saying that they would just withdraw from Europe. Although he quickly then backtracked on that. And the way that the EU AI Act is drafted is that if you're unable to meet it, then there is the risk of those systems being removed from the market as well. So what I'd expect for global companies to be doing is that, well, possibly one of two things. One is choosing which markets they operate in and potentially removing themselves from some markets because of the regulatory burden. Or alternatively, if it's possible to make it work legally, is a flight to the highest standard. So seen as having a higher standard than the US, but that if you meet the EU, you also meet the US. Thereby, the company is likely to then be trying to meet simultaneously. But it is a tricky one to do, especially when those regulations, as James has been talking about, will be adapting and evolving over time.
Yeah, I mean that's the approach we've seen to other pieces of legislation over time. So you either have this kind of high watermark approach where there isn't as much resource, so you just pick the one that looks like it's got the strictest requirements, which is often going to be the EU, and then everything complies with that standard. Now, I have problems with the approach because you end up with non-compliance in other areas. You miss things, and so the more expensive but more globally kind of compliant approach that global organizations take would be each time they're getting advice on how the product needs to be designed, they will get input from experts in each jurisdiction against local, and that can be very expensive.
2021 AI, just to give some context, so we're about 7-8 years old now, and we've been across sectors, but predominantly focusing within the regulated sectors, and specifically within the finance sector because of essentially where the CEO comes from, and also the makeup of the organisation, and also the maturity of our solutions, and also how we operate. And if we look at also what we're going to be covering today, so first a recap of 2023 and what this means for 2024, the AI regulatory landscape. So if you haven't been following that, we'll just give you a few of the key points there as to what's happened in likes of the EU, US and UK. Then also challenges of bringing Gen AI introductions. That's also LLMs. What's the challenges in actually going from a POC into an enterprise application? Then also implementing effective AI governance. So going from a traditional AI GRC or GRC system to a more lean AI governance framework. Then moving on to the AI future trends and directions for financial services and what you can do about this. So just starting off as well, 2021 AI, so and introducing myself, so really running the UK office. And if you think about 2021 AI, we're taking on one is AI acceleration, so moving organisations from POC to a production environment and really an emphasis around MLOps. We support that. And then the other is AI governance. So this is something that we've been working on for the last 5 years now. So we're not new to this space, and just more recently got the award for major player in the IDC market space. So I think what's interesting here is that this field is maturing as well. AI governance was more of a buzzword 2 years ago, and now they're starting to actually get recognition for this. There's more AI governance frameworks, there's more AI governance standardizations, and these standardizations are feeding into regulations that are going to be prevalent on a global perspective. So, and you can see here, it might be data and AI governance framework, might be also mass producing different frameworks over in Singapore as well. And then obviously you have the EU and different ISO standards as well. So starting off, a recap on 2023. So we didn't actually collaborate on the slides, but we've ended up using the same graph here. So I haven't copied anything, but I'm going to take a little bit of a different perspective here. So if you think about generative AI being at the top of this curve, and this is the main buzzword, but also this is where a lot of budget is going to be thrown towards as well, especially in experimentation, because a lot of different business units, let's say across a bank, are going to want to use this, but they might not have the skills in this. So how are you going to be able to move POC from the innovation hub or a centre of excellence into a production environment where you're either leveraging a team or a customer is actually interacting with the LLM itself? What are the controls around that? And if you look behind this, you have responsible AI, but then obviously a little bit further down you have AI TRISMs. This is the trust, risks and security management. So Gartner put out a paper on this a few months ago, and there's going to be more research around this. But essentially, that's going to be ensuring that these Gen AI POCs and the existing frameworks can actually be updated. So it's not going to stop in the POC environment, because if you're working with a POC or a Gen AI application or third-party software and it doesn't have the right controls, if it doesn't have the right risk assessment, how can you take it from that environment and actually start to expose it to an end client or making informed decisions or part of an actual workflow which is already in a bank? So it's really trying to actually take AI TRISM, prioritise this early on, and then that will actually enable a lot of the applications to move faster, going from just an idea. So looking at, and a lot of this is actually using some of the more interesting and relevant reports that I've been kind of scouring over the Christmas holidays in my time off. So this one's actually McKinsey, and it's respondents across regions, industries and seniority levels say they're using Gen AI tools. And if you actually look at financial services, this is the sector which say they're regularly using this for work, and this was taken earlier in the year, and I'll also share all of the reports that I reference and use here. But what you can see is if we go through them, there's already widespread experimentation, and I think that's a brilliant thing. But then actually moving that from experimentation actually into something which is being used by either a team or by the customers, or something that you can actually sell, and can you prove also that you're using the data in an ethical and responsible way? And I think that's where also a lot of organisations that are working and leveraging ChatGPT and having outcomes through using that, how can you actually ensure that the data has been validated or is GDPR compliant and so on. So then looking also more at the investment and board gender inclusion, so 40% of respondents from organisations adopting AI foreseeing increased investments in AI due to Gen AI. So again, we're going to see a lot of investments, especially on, so maybe last year there wasn't as big a spend when it comes to, and I use Gen AI as a loose, broad term just because it's easier to comprehend when applying it to different business functions as well. But at the beginning of last year, there wasn't actually as much budget allocated at the beginning of the year, whereas this year I think we're going to see a massive transition into lots of different business functions being able to have the budget, especially for Q1 and Q2, to do a lot more experimentation, working with and doing smaller POCs and pilots, and hopefully the second half of the year transitioning into more enterprise applications. Going through the year as well, so this was about 3 pages long, and I've tried to what gives a global perspective, but then also what's quite relevant to potentially everyone in this room or your organisations. So if we look at January last year, there was a NIST AI risk management framework, and this is constantly being iterated and adapted, and we're actually working with NIST on a program with Meta and Accenture, which is the open loop program, which is actually giving feedback into this and how that now applies, the NIST framework applies to Gen AI applications. So for instance, how can you start doing more red teaming, and what does that look like when it comes to a Gen AI application that's a third-party software, for instance. Then going through this as well, we saw Italy banning ChatGPT in March. What are more different governments or countries going to take this similar approach as well? And then moving further along, moving on to October, this is when President Biden gave the AI executive order, and they actually referenced the NIST AI risk management framework, and that's going to be quite relevant for regulations in the US. And we'll also see if you're an organisation operating in the UK but also operating in the US, you're going to have to be responsible for, or actually understand how to be compliant to all of these regulations. If you're a global bank, how can you have a compliance and governance framework that actually keeps up to date with all these different regulations, has the controls in place for all of them, but then can actually monitor this in a way that a central hub can actually look and have the oversight for this. Finally, finishing on the EU AI Act being agreed, and this is one of the biggest milestones here, and I think will actually shape a lot of the global regulations moving forward. Now, I haven't just taken reports as well, but it might look like I've got a bit more creative with ChatGPT images as we move forward. But here, if we look at actually the organisations that considered AI-related risks, so inaccuracy, cybersecurity, and IP infringement, regulatory compliance and explainability, they're all the top 5 here, and then it actually got deprioritised. Yeah. Oh, the full screen there. There we go. Okay, that's much better. And so, if we look also at some of the points on the side here, which are produced, it's implementation. So only 21% of respondents from organisations having policies governing the use of Gen AI technologies by employees. So we're going to see an explosion of different policies, different governance, risk and compliance frameworks, but then how do they actually get implemented, and who's going to be owning that? Is it going to be first line of defence, or is it going to be the third? I think this is something which is have to go to be decided amongst organisations. So now moving on to more, where have people been focusing as well, and you can see here it's quite clear that the reduction of costs on core businesses has not been actually the main focus. It's been more on the opportunities far outweigh this for actually creating new value generation, different insights, rather than actually focusing on reduction of costs. Now, if we look at that report and then other ones as well, and then what are the takeaways from that, is that there is widespread AI adoption, and I think this is obviously everyone knows that. That's why you're here, and a potential for immense growth as well, but also embedding that into the strategy. So it's not just someone experimenting in a Jupyter notebook or with an application. It's also how do you actually make this part of a wider strategy. upskilling the organisation as well, building the consumer trust. So how can you make it evidence that the applications that you're using are working with data responsibly? How can you, ensure that this is also transparent? Are you going to show that in your annual report to say, okay, we're complying with this regulation and that regulation, or actually in production, and this is how they're being used, and this is how this customer is actually interacting with that model? Is that transparency going to be a positive or a negative thing when presenting that? So I think what's going to be good is hopefully an explosion of different use cases where people are going to say, well, this is the end-to-end process of how I got it into production, these are the challenges, and then the industry can learn from that, so rather than keeping everything in a kind of secret manner. Now, we touched on the AI regulatory landscape and the UK, so whilst the FCA will be putting out regulations like the SS123 for model risk management principles in the UK, and there's also the ICO's guide around data protection and AI, then you've got the CMA as well, producing principles for maintaining competitive AI markets, and there's going to be more around the AI regulation. I think looking at what the EU's done as well, I think the challenge is going to be the fact that we want, and Rishi Sunak said about having a pro-innovation environment for the UK. Now that doesn't go too well with the EU, where they're saying, well, there's a lot more constraints around high, medium, and low risk. Are they going to have tight controls, but also have a pro-innovation environment as well? So we'll kind of see how the two of those merge, but also what's going to happen with the US. So, and the EU AI Act, if you're not aware as well, so this MIT review just gives a EU AI Act, but also other global regulations and what's happening there. But for instance, I think what's going to is understanding what AI do you actually have that's in operation, building an AI registry as well, and understanding what impacts or risks they have. So conducting a risk assessment, but then also continuous monitoring of different biases as well. So and understanding, is it a high risk AI application, medium or low? And the reality is that if you're operating in the EU and you fall foul of the regulation, then it could be a fine of up to 6% of your global revenue that year. So that's something which is also quite scary, especially for a large organisation. You have also the US, and I won't go too much into each of these because there's a fair bit to get through. And again, we touched on that with the NIST AI risk management framework. But then you have all countries like China as well, which is actually leading in certain aspects and actually moving their AI regulations through at quite a pace, but then Africa and so on. Now, what this could mean, so for an example here, so if you have a credit scoring model, the risk could be around bias that it could lead to unfair credit decisions. So under the EU AI Act, you must ensure that the AI system is trained with diverse representative data to minimise biases. So how can you actually do that in an automated way if you have 10 or 100 different attributes in this data and putting it into a format and then the quality is really quite tricky, and it's probably near impossible maybe, but it's something that people should aspire to, because otherwise you're going to be caught out when all of a sudden you don't know how you got that result, you don't actually have the information more documented. So the challenges for bringing Gen AI into production, so one being that there's a lack of control around the data, so whose data you're using, or sharing your data with the model as well. And if you hear stories of companies leaking IP as well, and that's what happened with Samsung earlier last year, and that meant that they had an organisational ban across. So if you work, how can you operate in a way where you're confidently working with data, where you actually have the right controls around each use case or user when it comes to their as well, or also actually train people around the potential for the LLMs, because if you're just using it in a very basic way, don't understand how to prompt engineer, haven't got focused on a specific use case, there's a lot of potential that's become left untouched. And then understanding the different LLMs. So at the moment there's a big explosion of different ones out there, but then what's going to be the advantage is it's going to be working with more smaller ones which are more focused on niche areas that don't use as much compute, or is it going to be, as Franki said earlier, a larger approach, so more, I think it's think fast or think slow. I have to read the book on that one. The biggest AI challenges as well. So what this report says here is that essentially models and tools become the models and tools pose challenges for high performance. So what are the models that we should be using? Because each time you're training with one, you're not training with another. So it's kind of an opportunity cost when you're in this experimentation phase. And also there's a lot of new tools on the market. Ready, or are they just a good UI that sits in front of ChatGPT? And it's being able to understand the difference between these two and how you can actually adopt this at an enterprise scale. So best practices for implementing effective AI governance. So here you'll see a model risk management process. So, and this is something that a lot of the traditional banks or financial will have, but if you look at some of the other sectors, they don't have this, so they have to actually recreate this from the beginning. So you look at the retail industry, for instance, like H&M and IKEA and so on, they won't have any of this, so they have to really create a whole three line of defense approach, how to actually audit all the models. Do they need to hire a chief or model validation team and so on? So the fortunate thing is banks and financial institutions already have this in place, but how do they adapt this to the explosion of shadow AI in different departments? How can you monitor this, but also how can you be more streamlined? Because I think a lot of people are going to want to see some outcomes at the end of the year when it comes to working with generative AI. Now, the approach to this is, obviously connecting all different stakeholders. There's going to be new ones in there with, a chief AI officer, prompt engineer, model validation. That's already been there, but then maybe more focusing around just specific AI model validation. What are the reports and how can reports when it comes to documenting bias if a model's retrained? Now, what we always advise is that you just should be starting with an AI registry, and some organizations already have this, but then how can you document? So you have to speak across an organization, understand where the models are, what is the system, what is the risk level, how is this actually running, and then how can you connect to that and actually capture the metrics that you need on a continual basis, and then integrate that to an existing enterprise risk management system or a new and updated one. Now, on the future trends as well, so look, one is obviously, I think we all know, but staying in the cloud. Although there is also the argument of exploring not being in the cloud for all the time, just through to security or sensitive data. Sensitive data issues as well. Then looking also at the risks as well, I think the hard part is actually the unforeseen risks. So if you're trying to lead from the front in with innovation in AI, how can you understand the AI risks that haven't been announced yet, that haven't been shared in the public domain as well? So this is where kind of some collaborative red teaming or some consortiums led by the regulators, where you work on different use cases, could also be valuable. Used as well, so for more personalized pricing models, how can this be achieved? And then collaborative collaboration as well from a regulatory standpoint. And what I'll do is I'll skip off that because I'm going to be sharing that, and that's a lot of text for you to read. So I thought I'd give you some more, but this is also an image by ChatGPT as well. I didn't make this earlier myself, so I was getting a bit carried away, as you can tell probably from a few of the other images. But when I touched on TRISM earlier, and I think it's really important because this is something we emphasise, because what we see is we speak to organisations where they're exploring with a Gen AI or a traditional AI application, but it always stops when you go, okay, yeah, we can get this value, but you haven't done risk assessment. You haven't ensured that it's compliant with the EU AI Act, for instance. Or how are you actually monitoring this, on a continual basis? And then what is the process, and how does that kind of embed into the existing process? And this is something that has to be considered as well. So if we also look at assessing generative AI tools, then also risk the third-party AI tools. So how can you not just have the in-house ones, but also adopt these? Monitoring this, and then countering adversarial AI attacks, and then finishing off with emerging AI regulations. So Whittakerism as well. We touched on these key points, but it's really to ensure trustworthiness is going to be a key point for all stakeholders and shareholders in the organisation, but also for you to communicate to your manager, okay, it's ready to come out and into production. And finishing off with, this is a view that we take with LLM governance. So, and this is really a key theme for us, which is, and we work with organisations not just on actually governing the LLMs, but also putting them into production and working on the prompt engineering and so on. So that's what is the risk of this? Designing the requirements, the guardrails, the field filters. What is the PII that you need to remove? What is the named entity recognition that actually should be there, and customizing this per use case, and obviously setting up and configuring this and then monitoring it on an ongoing basis, seeing what the problems are, and then assessing that as we continue. And that's the fastest I've ever gone through 30 slides. So thank you very much, and that was my presentation.
Okay, first of all, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Franki, for the introduction. As a bit about me, I'm not a tech person, but I am as a former foreign affairs producer, so working for the likes of Al Jazeera, Sky News and BBC World. And I currently work in comms and reputation management for a mixture of news brands, tech and media law firms, and government and international affairs clients, all of which has given me a fairly unique insight into how media, tech, foreign affairs and government intersect, and some of the challenges that AI is bringing to the sector that I work in, and to information, content and democracy. So coming out of this talk, hopefully you'll understand a little bit more about what the historic relationship has been between content and non-generative AI, the evolving relationship between content and generative AI, why text-based Gen AI is more of a threat to misinformation, why image-based Gen AI is more of a threat to disinformation, why Gen AI matters going into this year, and why this is a global year in terms of democracy, and some of the next steps as we look ahead. So some of the laws, guardrails, and the future of Gen AI and content when it comes to journalism. So I think the first thing to note is that over the last year, ever since ChatGPT burst onto the scene, people have AI is a bit of a catch-all phrase when what they really mean is generative AI. But analytical AI, which focuses on analysing existing data to make predictions or decisions, has been around for a long time, and it has a very long-standing relationship with the media industry. So by that I mean journalism, and I do also mean advertising. So on the journalism front, that could mean news gathering, so in terms of automated transcription, translation, extracting text from images, and scraping the web, but also news distribution, so using AI-driven search engines to tailor content to a specific audience. So you've clicked on this article, you might also like this article. It's also got a very prevalent relationship with digital marketing and advertising and social media. So, for example, segmenting customers, personalizing campaigns, analyzing data about user preferences, automating social posts and optimizing posting schedules, managing conversations with followers, and most importantly, it has a very long-standing relationship with programmatic advertising and ad exchanges, which will come in relevant later for misinformation. And what an ad exchange is a digital marketplace that enables advertisers and publishers to buy and sell advertising space, which could be display, video and mobile ad inventory, including on maybe a newspaper website or on social media, often through real-time auctions. And this is important because anyone can buy that space from an ad exchange, unlike a private exchange where a publisher might say we only want to sell our space to certain parties. Anyone can buy that space off an ad exchange. What is really changing though between journalism an AI is its relationship between content and generative AI. So as we know, it's a deep learning model that can generate high quality text, images, and other content based on the data that they were trained on. 90% of newsrooms are already using some form of AI. In news production, 80% in news distribution, and 75% in news gathering. And we really tend to hear about it when it goes wrong. So when you hear articles where it's riddled with misinformation and fake news, and it hasn't been fact-checked. But the impact that generative AI is having on journalism goes far beyond just producing those articles. So the first thing is that it has been seen as a threat to jobs. So not long after ChatGPT burst onto the scene, BuzzFeed announced a load of layoffs and saying that they were going to really focus more on AI for producing listicles and content. But this is also a risk in terms of IP. So who actually owns that article that's being put out? If a journalist is, providing most of the data and most of the information into that model, then it will probably fall down to the journalist and the journalistic platform. But if they're, using a very light touch approach and really relying on the AI to provide most of that information, the IP and ergo the royalties might actually come down to the platform and not actually the journalists. It's also a risk in terms of defamation and liability. At the end of the day, if it's a very small publisher or as an individual, you probably aren't going to get into that much hot water there that's not true. If as a major publisher you're putting something out that's not true and it's fairly scandalous, you will be liable for that. It's also a very big issue when it comes to news scraping and copyright infringement. So a lot of the large models are focused on scraping the web and taking that information from outlets without giving them compensation. It's also a big issue in terms of content moderation, authentication, and misinformation. So text-based AI is able to convincing conspiracy theories in a way by smoothing out grammar and syntax that previously you might have seen something on the web and go, actually, that sounds a bit fishy. AI is making that, or generative AI is making that more believable. It can also cause story suppression and censorship, so overwhelming the facts that we do want to get out there. And it's also impacting the human interaction with journalism. So in terms of reduced human insight and input, a lot of the time as journalists, we deal with really traumatic stories. We rely on sources, we rely on investigation. We cannot trust AI to actually have those conversations within real life individuals or to uphold editorial standards as might be laid out by Ofcom or Ipso. And all of this could really weaken trust in news models, the lines between fact and fiction. And finally, the last way it could really impact newsrooms is that news is funded by advertising, in the sense that we will sell our space to advertisers. But suddenly, if information seekers aren't coming to newspapers to get their information and they're going to AI models, and for advertisers to integrate their content with newsrooms, it might see that they move more towards putting their advertisements on AI models. All of this has resulted in a fairly big battle between OpenAI specifically and publishers. So you might have seen that recently the New York Times is suing OpenAI for copyright infringement for training their data on New York Times content without permission. We've also seen this with Getty Images, who are suing Stability AI for trainings on images. So at the moment, publishers and OpenAI are really trying to navigate this new space on how they work together. OpenAI has put out a statement saying that ultimately they can't do copyright, that they can't protect copyright for absolutely everything. They need access to news and data for accurate real-time information. And if they can only use open information, it could provide inadequate AI systems. But at the same time, publishers, unsurprisingly, aren't really happy about this. And so the question is, what happens next? So a lot of publishers, so for example, Axel Springer has recently entered negotiations and a partnership with OpenAI access to a portfolio of titles. We're also seeing talks going on between Fox, CNN, Time, and the real question is just how much publishers should be getting royalties if they provide that information. So the figure floating around is between 1 to 5 million, but at the end of the day, if you're the likes of BBC News, that's probably not going to be enough for you. And other publishers, like the BBC, have put crawlers on their website just to protect any of their content being ripped. So we're now coming on to more the misinformation space. This is perhaps more my opinion, but I personally think that text-based generative AI is more of a risk to misinformation, which, as Franki touched on earlier, is false or inaccurate information, getting the facts wrong, but not necessarily deliberately. On one hand, this could come down to the inherent training bias of whoever created the platform. So if you've got a political leaning, or you might unwittingly impart those biases when you're training that model. It can also cause hallucinations. So when a large language model perceives patterns or objects that are non-existent and puts out something that simply isn't true. And this could be really dangerous when it comes to misinformation and fake news. So people might come to a language model looking for information, and if it doesn't have access to live time news, which is kind of what we need from publishers, they could then get information that's inaccurate or out of date, and particularly in a breaking news scenario when you're really under pressure and facts are moving really, really quickly, that could then cause false information to spread around. And it's worth noting that ChatGPT in itself last year acknowledged that it does have its own weaknesses. So a fact-checking firm called NewsGuard asked it various questions, and it told them bad actors could weaponize me by fine-tuning my model with their own data, which could include false or misleading information. And this was actually ironically true, because when the researchers put 100 prompts into ChatGPT involving false narratives, it merely provided fake information in 80% of its responses. Disinformation is not the same as misinformation. So disinformation is false information which is deliberately intended to mislead and intentionally misstating the facts for an ulterior motive. And again, where I see it is that deepfakes, images and audio are far bigger a risk to this than text-based information. We are reaching a critical inflection point for image generation where we cannot spot fakes without context. So this was one that went viral last year of Trump being arrested. But it's a little bit blurry, there are little signs that it's not real. And again, the Pope is not, does not normally wear a puffer jacket. But what happens when it's combined with traditional AI and programmatic advertising, and it can buy those spaces online, it does cause a rapid dissemination of fake news. And this is just an example that was shared recently by a BBC investigative journalist. These images are all fake, none of them are real. And actually, if I was glancing at some of those, I probably wouldn't realise they were AI generated. All of this is very important as we go into this year, which is an absolutely enormous year for democracy. So where goes to the polls this year? Well, where doesn't go to the polls this year? We're looking at over 50 countries. So the US, the UK, Taiwan, India, multiple countries in South America, Africa. There will not be another electoral cycle on this scale until 2048. So a very, very long time. That is 52% of the world's population will be going to the polls. That is, I believe it's between 4 to 5 billion people. And AI-powered misinformation is the world's biggest short-term threat, which is a report that recently came out of Davos. So why this matters? Whoever gets into power can influence the direction of AI and cross. AI policy is developing really rapidly. It's not there yet. So whoever gets into power in whatever those countries, they can really influence the direction of that. But it also goes beyond AI. It will have huge implications for human rights, economies, international relations, and prospects of peace. So governments, big tech, and civil society will to protect election integrity. Democracy and trust will be undermined. And a less trusting public is a public that may lose faith in the entire electoral process. It could even put them off voting altogether. Will deepen. AI disinformation will exacerbate existing divides and even create new ones. And digital integrity measures will come under stress. Again, AI is a relatively new technology when it comes to generative AI, and there's never been an electoral cycle on this scale. But I will say that again, AI, analytical AI, they're not the same thing, and when they come together, this will be really dangerous for democracy in terms of electoral process. So we could see personalised disinformation campaigns. So it's tailored to the individual preferences, which will deepen ideological divisions. So if you're very much leaning to one side of the spectrum and you're really much engaging with that content, the algorithm will suggest you more of its kind. Deep fakes, which we will get more into. So political figures are already nearly indistinguishable from what is real and what isn't. And everything could be manipulated. So we could see speeches manipulated, interviews manipulated, hot mics, and that could really confuse voters. As well as social media manipulation. So again, the algorithm will recommend us content based on what's performing. But the problem with that is that it makes talking points seem popular or endorsed when they aren't, or you're seeing something very much suggested to you. You could think that's going to be a really big issue in the election and really focus on that when actually it's not that big an issue at all. So we're going to go through some motives and goals and examples for what the purpose of deep fakes and misinformation is. So it could amplify domestic divisions. Ultimately, people have a vested interest in who is governing their own country. But bad actors will also have an interest in who else is governing other countries. So for example, China will have a very invested interest in the outcome of Taiwan's election. So they're with that. Similarly, with Russia and Ukraine, both Ukraine is going to the polls, as is Russia. Russia will obviously have a vested interest in both of those. Sometimes when it comes to the election, it's not, I don't think all of us believe that any election is always free and fair. Certainly in Russia's case, it won't be. Most of Putin's opponents are jailed or no longer with us. But if he does get into power again, this just strengthens his hand and gives him legitimacy for the next round of elections. So when it also comes down to political attacks and how these bad actors are influencing their own leadership or other countries' leadership, half of Americans and Brits believe they see disinformation every day, and 99% of Americans believe they can also spot it, but 3/4 of them are actually overestimating their abilities. This is actually a recent report that came out from iNews that found that 42% of voters are susceptible to deepfakes. They don't realise that they're not real. And the problem is that if you assume that people are only listening to half the news, they're only kind of paying attention to the side that they're interested in, they'll get suggested more of that. And then that news is amplified in ways that is more one-sided. True information on top of that, and it can make it much, much harder to distinguish between what is real and what isn't. And it becomes harder for voters to understand what the issues are, what politicians will do about them. And at the same time, people with extreme views can get much more attention by using digital means in a way that they simply could not have done before. And a lot of this can come down to timing. So when it comes to deepfakes, at the end of the day, people have a relatively low trust in media. They've got a relatively low trust in political campaigns. But as we remember with Brexit, 2% can be everything. It was 48-52. So you might think, oh, 2%, if that only sways 2% of the population, that could still have a very big difference. And timing, again, it is everything. So we saw this a lot with deepfakes last year in Slovakia's elections. So 48 hours before the polls, a deepfake was released, or manipulated audio was released, in which the leader of the Progressive Slovakia Party went viral, in which he was discussing with a journalist how to rig the elections. That was fake. The problem was that was released at a time when there was a 40-hour media blackout. So we have a similar situation in the UK, that when the polls are live, we can't discuss political news. You just have to so they can get on with it. And so if a deepfake is released at that time, it is really hard for politicians and the media to actually stick their hands up and say that's not real. And again, financial attacks, I think when it comes to democracy, we very much think along the lines of elections, but financial attacks exist as well. A share price dip based on a deep fake about a company or disinformation about a company, it won't necessarily last long because the company can put out a statement saying, hey, this isn't true. But it will actually have a temporary dip on the stock market and consider the effect on a country's financial standing. If several major companies come under attack, it could cause major instability, and the company and the country at large, other countries could doubt its. I can hear echoes. I haven't put down. And the stock market would wobble, and global markets would begin doubting the country's financial stability if several companies were coming under attack. Threats are for different countries. We'd be doing disservice if we said that every country cares about the same issues. So I just want to talk recently about a study that an AI firm and disinformation tracking firm called Logically did. So Logically found that Midjourney, DALL-E, and Stable Diffusion, which are image-based generative AIs, accepted more than 85% of prompts looking to generate evidence for mis and disinformation claims. And what we can see, these are all images that they generated, and they were able to find, using examples of India's elections, the US elections, and the UK elections, zeroing in on some of the narrative themes that have been of concern for voters. They were able to generate disinformation for all of those issues. So, for example, some of the issues that we are really polarising for voters in the UK, things like civil unrest, immigration, migrants coming over the channel, and the problem with that, see that and kind of use that as evidence that that the current leading party, this is a result of their policies. So in the US elections, we saw this a lot during the 2020 elections. Trump really went out on a limb claiming election tampering. And again, so this one is slightly less sketchy. He's got 3 hands and multiple fingers. But every single platform was able to generate images showing election boxes being tampered with, which is an issue of concern for US voters. And then again in India, so the big ones of concerns for Indian voters are militancy, religion, and election security. So a common theme is that the Indian National Congress supports militancy in Kashmir. Other issues are that one side is anti-Muslim or anti-Hindu. And again, election security, election tampering. And so both of these images Logically was able to show militancy or a lorry carrying a voting box being robbed. So we now come on to the current guardrails, trust and safety and media literacy. The problem is that with AI, is that the technology is developing so fast and the law and policy is simply not in place to keep up with it and has not developed speed. So the EU AI Act, which is in recent discussions and has now been voted through, that takes a fairly robust approach to AI regulation, and far more than any other country or community. So in the sense that it will regulate AI on different levels of risk, but we then come into the UK where we don't actually have a direct equivalent yet. That is, the government doesn't want to stifle innovation and what that might mean for startups. So it's probably take a fairly more liberal view. And it also comes on to the online harms bill. That's been kicking around since, I believe, 2017, 2018, and it was originally focused on social media regulation in terms of harmful content. It was only around this time last year that they said, actually, we're also going to regulate AI. So that so it's a very, very, very long process. It's been kicking on for years. It has to go through several votes in Parliament, several iterations, and then obviously by the time it comes to pass, we could have gone through God knows how many iterations of new AI. And it also comes down to an issue of enforcing that policy across different jurisdictions. So what might be illegal in the US might not be illegal in the UK, might not be illegal in the EU. And let's face it, if you're a bad actor, you're not going to say, oh no, the law tells me I can't do this, guess I better not do it. They will still do it. So the law is there in terms of providing incentive to not do something and a guidance on what to do, but it's not actually going to stop it. And a lot of issues when it comes to deepfakes and AI and democracy, the law just doesn't actually exist there. So for example, we can look at deepfakes. The interesting thing when it comes to your image, if you're a politician or a journalist and someone's taken your image and used it to create a deepfake, is that you can own the copyright to your photo. An AI is not your photo. So you then have an issue where someone could be showing an image of you that's showing you doing something that you didn't do, and you can't actually own that image. So at the moment, the law just doesn't really make those balances. This will likely lean more into media law, so it will likely lean more into areas of defamation. So we might see some developments in that area, but again, the law is not there yet. So this now comes down to whether tech platforms should be policing themselves. The problem is that we've seen a lot of shifting resources in tech platforms, prioritising profit. Multiple platforms have let go their trust and safety teams and their content moderation teams, which will make things really difficult as we go in towards the election. So newer platforms, such as Discord and Twitch, they are setting up processes for democracy as we go into this year. But they've never dealt with election process on this cycle, whereas those that have been around for a while, so Meta and Google, they will also be doing the same thing. And are probably slightly better equipped to deal with it. Meta has announced a new AI policy requiring political ads to bear a disclaimer if it contains AI content, and says it will remove content that violates policies, whether it was created by AI or not. However, this might come down to more fighting talk, because recently a video went viral on Facebook in which it claimed that Joe Biden was a paedophile, and it just stayed up. And then we now come down to X, which formerly known as Twitter, which is an absolute Wild West right now. So ever since Elon took it over, most of the content moderation teams have been let go. People can buy verification. You don't know what's real, what isn't. And we now come back to programmatic advertising, because most of legitimate advertisers have pulled their space from X. And certainly I've seen it myself as a very big user of X. Disinformation claims, political advertising, advertisements telling me I should buy things as open source intelligence. It's not a new thing, so there have been pioneers in this space. So I could talk about Bellingcat, for example, who are really known for tracking information across the internet. Probably leans more into digital forensics. What is new is that mainstream journalists are now really recognising that they can't just report the news, they also have to debunk fake news. So in the last couple of years, the BBC and Sky News, among others, have set up dedicated OSINT teams, the BBC's version is called BBC Verify, to work out what's real and what isn't. And it's key to note that the responsibility and pressure of working in a newsroom is absolutely enormous, because if we get it wrong, it weakens trust in the entire news ecosystem. And this can be really, really challenging in breaking news. You want to be the person that gets it first. And this can also cause fog of war reporting. At the end of the day, you can verify something as much as you want to get 2 sources, 3 sources. Sometimes we are still going to get it wrong. And again, that can be catastrophic for people's trust in the news system. They can then turn to the outlet and say, well, you got it wrong, we don't trust you, and then it absolutely spirals. So we saw this happen recently in Gaza with the Al-Ali Arab hospital explosion. Because Western into Gaza, it was happening at night. We didn't have access to up-to-date information, people on the ground. Various big outlets, so including the CNN and BBC, were blaming one side or the other without verification, which got very messy the next morning when multiple disclaimers then had to go out and corrections had to be made. So is AI-generated fake news the biggest threat in terms of misinformation during warfare and foreign affairs, which is one of the other issues that I work on? The good news is no. The bad news is that because misinformation in warfare is so much, that AI is just another string to its bow. So when it comes down to, do we trust that image, do we trust that source, or do we trust what this account is saying online? One of the issues that we are really seeing in terms of social media disinformation is fake accounts. So you might have mass-generated accounts, so multiple accounts pushing a theory, but of course they aren't real people, they're bots, and it might be that if a different issue emerges that's relevant to that bad actor, those accounts can all change their pictures, they can all change what they're suddenly saying and disseminate it at scale. So they could end up switching identities. One of the issues that I've also seen a lot is fake journalists. So this happened in Gaza. The BBC and Al Jazeera both had to put out claims after journalists or accounts were putting up identities saying they were journalists, Al Jazeera saying they were journalists for the BBC, and they had to say, these people don't work for us, these aren't real people. The problem, of course, is that people want to trust journalists, they follow those accounts, they trust what they're saying, and they will then share that information believing it's been fact-checked, and those are real journalists, and they're not. And it's not just accounts, we've also seen deep fakes manipulated of BBC journalists, and that those videos aren't real. One of the other issues that we might have when it comes to accounts, and I've actually seen this happen to me personally, where a journalist might follow me and I think, oh, they're a journalist, I'll follow them back. And then they'll switch their identity and I'm like, hang on, I thought I was following a BBC journalist, why am I now following this random person in this random country? And again, this has become really challenging with Twitter, ever since Elon Musk removed verification and blue ticks. So for those that don't know about that, it used to be the case that on Twitter, if you had a blue tick, you couldn't buy a blue tick, it was assigned to you, so if you're a person of interest. And it was really great because you could know that person actually was who they said they were. That's now not the case. Anyone can buy a blue tick. People who had originally been verified lost their verification, and so you have to check and triple check everything. So you might see BBC News blue tick and think, oh, that's real, and then you look at the handle and it's actually at BBC. And it's these tiny little nuances that you suddenly realise that account isn't what it says it is. And we saw a lot of fun happen when Elon first removed that verification. So people pretending to be different presidents. One account pretended it was a US pharmaceutical company and said, hey, insulin is now free, and it absolutely tanked the stock market. So people have to be really careful. And again, people just have to be careful in terms of what they're sharing. So when it comes down to fake news and why AI-generated fake news is not the biggest threat, so these are a couple of examples that we see on screen at the moment. You don't have to rely on AI for fake news in war reporting, and that's not to say it doesn't exist. So one of the issues we've seen in Gaza, so Bloomberg recently reported that TikTok was really struggling to take down deep fakes of people who'd been killed in the Hamas attack, and suddenly these deep fakes of people who were dead were suddenly appearing on TikTok. We might also see issues with deep fake generated images of babies, and when this happens, it's because it's highly emotive. People will lean into children. Because it's emotive, people are more shocked by it, they're more likely to share it. But it goes beyond AI. So, for example, what we see on screen here, this photo, it was a Facebook photo from a couple of from a competition in Thailand, a Halloween competition. That little boy is dressed as a ghost and he's texting on his phone. Someone pulled that image and then it went viral, and they claimed that it was a crisis act of someone who was pretending to be a dead body in Gaza now texting. And so to kind of disprove that the impact of the airstrikes in Gaza weren't as bad as people were making out. And that obviously then goes viral, but that's not from Gaza. The other issue you might see is that people get very quick to follow things. And the issue is that there's a saying that, a lie can get halfway around the world before it gets its boots on. The correction never goes as far as the original claim. And there inevitably will be people with much bigger platforms than us as individual journalists or individual journalism platforms that suddenly have huge reach. So Justin Bieber wrote praying for Israel. That is not Israel, that is Gaza City. So it now comes down to keeping yourself aware and really what we ourselves as individuals can do. So we can look for AI quirks. So that could be odd phrasing, irrelevant tangents, or sentences that don't quite fit the overall narrative signs. They're signs of AI written text. And I touched on this earlier when I was talking about syntax and grammar and how text-driven AI can really smooth that out and make it harder to identify. With images and videos, it could be changes in lighting, strange facial movements, and I don't know what it is. Generative AI hates fingers. People often get multiple extra hands, multiple extra fingers. Consider the source. Is it a reputable source such as the Associated Press or BBC, and is it the real handle? Or is this coming from a site that you've never heard of? And do your own research. Google what you saw in the post. So there are applications like TinEye where you can reverse image search and see if it's real or if it's just more AI content or fake content that went viral. So again, this comes in useful. So I mentioned the Gaza Crisis Act earlier. One of the other issues I saw in the recent war in Gaza, or the ongoing war in Gaza, is that people would say photos would go viral. I could then search that photo and they would say, hey, this actually isn't a photo from Gaza. This is a war photo, but it's from Syria or it's from Afghanistan. And it can tell you where that image has come from, where it's been published elsewhere. Get a reality check. I think we all have a tendency these days to really doom scroll. And again, the algorithm will suggest you more and more. So do take some time out and talk with people you trust about the stuff you're seeing. It can be harmful to keep yourself in a bit of knowledge. And again, what continues to work best when fighting any kind of fake news, whether it's generated by humans or AI, is to just not share it. So shout out to Justin Bieber, don't share photos of Gaza City saying it's Israel. And I'm just going to close by saying, because I've been very doom and gloom in this, do I think that AI is, the be-all and end-all of journalism? I will say that I think generative AI is a huge problem for the journalism industry in terms of deep fakes, in terms of what it means for IP, copyright, and again, I love the journalism industry, and it's not one that is is without its issues in terms of job availability. It's very insecure, and AI is going to make all of those issues worse. But I do think analytical AI could be the solution to fight some of the issues that are being caused by generative AI. So when it comes to content moderation, and in terms of creating a library of verified claims to cross-check against, that could be a solution where generative AI, as far as I'm concerned, is just more of a problem for journalism. And then I'll pass back to Franki now.
Thank you so much.